this video, we're going to discuss the new code of conduct for the Philippine Judiciary. So for the first part, we'll discuss independence, integrity, impartiality, propriety, equality, and competence and diligence as something which must be present with the judges. Okay? So, or the members rather of the judiciary. So for independence, let's talk about independence. Judicial independence is a prerequisite to the rule of law and the fundamental guarantee of a fair trial. A judge shall therefore uphold and exemplify judicial independence in both its individual and institutional aspects. For illustration, let's take the case of Marces Sr. versus Arcangel or Archangel. So whether or not Judge Arcangel is guilty of serious misconduct, grave abuse of authority, harassment, and immorality. The Supreme Court held yes as to misconduct. The charges have not only been proven by substantial and convincing evidence, but have actually been admitted by respondent judge. Thus, complainant alleges that he was informed by Judge Sarabia that the warrants had been issued by him upon the request of respondent judge. This allegation is supported by a handwritten note of respondent judge. Instead of being delivered to the warrant officer, the warrants were actually given to Mrs. Cañas. So it is clear that respondent intervened in the feud between the complainant's family and the Cañas family, and such interference was not limited to the barangay mediation proceedings but extended as well to the various stages of the conflict. And these acts of respondent judge must be viewed not as a single isolated accusations, but in their totality and in the context of the enmity between the two feuding families. Thus, viewed we find the accusations of respondent proper and censurable. Next case, Oca versus De Guzman Jr. The issue in this case is whether or not the Judge De Guzman is guilty of misconduct. The Supreme Court held yes as to trying to influence the course of the litigation in the subject case. Okay. So, next we have the case of Garcia versus Valdez. The Supreme Court, the issue in this case first is whether or not Judge Valdez violated the code of judicial ethics. The Supreme Court had yes, because aside from the acts of interference, the respondent judge can be faulted with authorized practice of law. So clearly, his interest in the administrative cases before the Darab cannot be considered as merely cursory or that of a disinterested third party or observer as he purported to be. He spoke in behalf of the defendants and he advanced their cause, making him in effect as their legal advocate. Because the use of court hours for matters or business falling outside the ambit of judicial concerns can also be imputed to the respondent judge. Another extant premises, the respondent judge utilized improperly the resources of the court. So, respondent judge has failed to conduct himself in the manner prescribed in the provisions of Canon 2 of the Code of Judicial Conduct. Okay, so he is reprimanded. Let's talk about integrity. So, integrity is essential not only to the proper discharge of the judicial office, but also to the personal demeanor of judges. In the case of Oca versus Necessar et al., 2013 case, the issue is whether or not the judges and personnel of the MTCC and RTC in Cebu City are guilty of gross ignorance of the law, gross neglect of duty, or gross inefficiency and gross misconduct, and in turn warrant the most severe penalty of dismissal from service. The Supreme Court held yes. The OCA found that judges Necesario, Acosta, Tormis, and Rosales are all guilty of gross inefficiency or neglect of duty when they solemnize marriages without following the proper procedure laid down by law, particularly the family code. Okay. So, they are now dismissed from service. Next case is Tobias versus Limsiaco Jr., 2011 case. The issue is whether or not Judge Limsiaco violated the new code of judicial conduct. The Supreme Court held yes, although Tobias failed to prove by substantial evidence her allegation that respondent offers package deals to prospective litigants in his court. The investigation revealed that respondent committed acts unbecoming of a judge, in particular, talking to a prospective litigant in his court, recommending a lawyer to litigant, and preparing the motion to withdraw as counsel of attorney Robert Vanillo, which pleading was filed in his court and was acted upon by him. Next, let's discuss impartiality. So, impartiality is essential to the proper discharge of the judicial office. It applies not only to the decision itself, but also to the process by which the decision is made. Let's take the case of law firm of Chavez versus Justice Dick Deacon, and etc. The issue is whether Justice Dick Deacon violated the Code of Judicial Conduct. Supreme Court held no. Aside from his naked allegations, conjecture, and speculations, he failed to present any other evidence to prove his charges. Hence, the presumption that respondent regularly performed his duties prevails. On the other hand, respondent justice adequately explained that since his voluntary inhibition from the case, he no longer participated in the case, and his perceived participation in the issuance of the assay resolution was a result of a typographical mistake. Next, we have the case of Salazar versus Marigomen. The issue is whether or not Judge Marigomen is guilty of gross ignorance of the law, manifest bias, and deliberate falsehood or dishonesty. Supreme Court held yes. Respondents' question acts do not conform to Canon 3 and 5 of the new Code of Judicial Conduct. Respondents claim that he allowed the protestees' counsel, Attorney Roeles, to testify over the objection of the protestants' counsel because the latter failed to submit a memorandum in support of the objection, and it's belied by the records of the case. Thus, in a pleading caption manifestation, the protestants' counsel submitted a memorandum of authorities on the matter. Respondent also indeed failed to state in his decision why he invalidated 90 ballots in favor of the protestant and to specify the ballots being set aside, thereby violating the Constitution. Now let's discuss propriety. Propriety and the appearance of propriety are essential to the performance of all activities of a judge. Let's take the case of Reyes versus Duque, 2010 case, whether or not Judge Duque is guilty of impropriety and gross misconduct. Supreme Court held yes. Substantial evidence pointed to Judge Duque's liability for impropriety and gross misconduct when he sexually assaulted Reyes. Judge Duque merely attempted to destroy the credibility of Reyes when he insinuated that she could be a woman of ill repute or a high-class prostitute, or one whose moral value is at its lower level. However, no judge has a right to solicit sexual favors from a party litigant, even from a woman of loose morals. So, kung dito, sa case na kung di pa siya retired, yung misconduct niya would have merited his dismissal from the service. Another case for illustration is the case of Justice King and Sons versus Hontanosas. So, the issue is whether or not Justice King, I think it's Judge. So, whether or not Judge Hontanosas is guilty of improper conduct, gross ignorance of the law, and negligence in the performance of his duty. Supreme Court held yes, because on the alleged demand for 250,000, which is present in this case, there's improper solicitation from litigants, which is a grave offense that carries an equally grave penalty. In the present case, the credible testimonies of the King brothers meet the required quantum of evidence. Sorry, not judge pala, hindi pala sila judge. Now, the King brothers meet the required quantum of evidence which justifies our conclusion that respondent indeed demanded 250,000 from them, and such conduct is a violation of Rule 1, Canon 1, and Rule 2, Canon 2 of the Code of Judicial Conduct. Next, we have the case of Lorenzana versus Austria. The issue is whether or not she acted with grave incompetence and gross ignorance of the law. Supreme Court said yes, only as to the creation of the Management Committee. To constitute gross ignorance of the law, it is not enough that the decision, order, or accusation of the judge in the performance of his official duties is contrary to existing law and jurisprudence. It must also be proven that he was moved by bad faith, fraud, dishonesty, or corruption, or had committed an error so egregious that it amounted to bad faith. So, You just read the case Roresana versus Austria. Now let's talk about equality. So ensuring equality of treatment to all before the courts is essential to the due performance of the judicial office. Let's take the case of Korea versus Belen, a 2010 case. The issue is whether or not Judge Belen is guilty of misconduct. So Supreme Court held yes, a judge must consistently be temperate in words and in actions. Responded Judge Belen's insulting statements tending to project complainant's ignorance of the laws and procedure coming from his inconsiderate belief that the latter mishandled the cause of his client is obviously and clearly insensitive, distasteful, and inexcusable. Such abuse of power and authority could only invite disrespect from counsels and from the public. Patience is one virtue that members of the bench should practice at all times, and courtesy to everyone is always called for. Conduct unbecoming of a judge is classified as a light offense under Section 10, Rule 140, penalized under Section 11, Paragraph C thereof. Now let's talk about competence and diligence. These are prerequisites to the due performance of judicial office. Let's take the case of Valdez versus Torres. The issue is whether or not Torres is guilty for the delay in the subject civil case. The Supreme Court held yes, because judges are oft reminded of their duty to promptly act upon cases and matters pending before their courts. So Rule 3.5, Canon 3 of the Code of Judicial Conduct, directs judges to dispose of the court's business promptly and decide cases within the required periods. Okay, here more than 4 years after being submitted for resolution, the civil case was still awaiting decision by respondent, and respondent irrefragably failed to decide the case within the 30-day period prescribed by the revised rule on summary procedure. Records do not show that the respondent made any previous attempt to report and request for extension of time to resolve the case. Okay. So, another case is the case of Virginesa Suarez versus Dilag. I just read the case, no? And another is case of Cañeda versus Menchavez. The issue in this case whether or not Judge Menchavez violated the Code of Judicial Conduct for the Philippine Judiciary. The Supreme Court held yes, bringing out a gun for everyone present in the court to see, even for purposes of maintaining order and decorum in the court, is inexcusable in the absence of overt acts of physical aggression by a party before the court. Okay? So, he is liable for vulgar and unbecoming conduct, and thus punished with light charge, punishable by a fine of not less than 1K but not exceeding 10K. For our next video, we'll discuss disqualification and inhibition of judicial officers.